Hello everyone. I wanted to do what is probably going to be a two-part video where I give my sort of response and opinions on kind of the current state of the manosphere, and not so much in terms of lamenting kind of how things have gone downhill since the mid to late 20 teens when I was making content starting in 2017 up until now. I realize that things have gone downhill in the men's community in some ways, and I think in other ways, there's still good messages that can be heard. And I'm going to get into that probably in the second part of this video. In the first part of this video, I wanted to just basically give my opinions on the different sort of segments of the manosphere and what I think is an overall positive, or at least potentially positive and good, message for men versus some of the negative messages. And this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree on the particulars on each group that I'm going to discuss here. But I wanted to just sort of give my take on this, what I've seen going on since I started making content in 2017 and kind of where we're at now. Some of it has remained pretty similar, some of it's changed a little bit. But in this part of the video, this first part, I wanted to just talk about my kind of impressions of the different groups and what I think is healthy and good and what I think is not a positive part of the men's community. So, broadly speaking, my take is that content that informs or educates men within this community in such a way as to encourage them to make good decisions for themselves as individuals is healthy and should be welcomed, even if we personally disagree with certain points of advice, right? Even if you want to talk about, for example, should men even entertain the idea of being in relationships and dating? Is that still potentially a positive experience? Is it not potentially a positive experience? I think those kinds of discussions can be had in a healthy way as long as we're still trying to give men advice that they can use, to teach men basically what their options are, what's realistically on the table or not, given the state of affairs in this society, given how our culture actually operates today, or the complete dysfunction in how it operates today. I think that those sort of perspectives are good even when there are differences of opinion. Whereas unhealthy influences tend to encourage men to exist for the sake of chasing women or for benefiting society instead of focusing on individual self-improvement for men as its own goal. The things that try to take men's interests and continue to turn those interests in a way that doesn't really help those men. Those are the negative aspects of the men's community, red pill, whatever you want to call all of it, right? And I'm going to get into the red pill specifically and what I think it means probably in part 2, because I think that that's going to make this video too long and I actually want to try to keep this to a reasonable time frame. So, although these factors that I've just mentioned can all be intertwined, right? You can talk about what's good for society and try to make the claim that it's also good for the individual man. Or you can talk about how men still want to be with women, so maybe dating's still healthy for them, or maybe it's not. These things can be intertwined in different ways, but the key difference is the intent, depending on the type of message that's being disseminated. In other words, are you genuinely trying to help men make good decisions for themselves? And maybe your perspective is just a little bit different than what another man's perspective is. But are you actually trying to help men have a better life for their own sake? Or are you just basically pouring out a bunch of nonsense because you think that's what's going to be good for women? Or that continues your ability to sort of make profit by giving men advice that may not actually be good for them as an individual? That's the key difference. Even if we have disagreements on particular issues, is the intent at the very least to try to help men better themselves and better their potential futures? Or is the intent to try to twist that into something that still just benefits women or benefits the government or benefits society at large, even if it's not beneficial to the man? So in my opinion, MGTOW, or men going their own way, pretty much have had the best message overall, particularly when they focus on avoiding exploitation in society while focusing on self-improvement. You can argue that sometimes MGTOWs talk too much about women, and I've discussed a lot of the anti-MGTOW arguments and the flaws that typically exist in those arguments, because usually They're not really about trying to present a particular point of view that says, oh, well, maybe men should get married or men should cohabitate because it's actually good for them. Usually those arguments fall short. They're usually very flawed. They're based on shaming. For the most part, I think that the MGTOW philosophy is correct, even if you want to point at individual examples of men that claim to be MGTOW that maybe aren't doing things that are very good for themselves. In general, as a philosophy, I think it's actually a very healthy point of view, given the state of affairs in society today especially. I think that the good parts of men going their own way are very valuable and potentially can have a very positive impact on the men that hear that message. However, I also think that the MRAs, for the most part, have a healthy view on what it is that they speak of, because they're at least pointing out the facts. They're talking about how things are for men today. The one thing about the men's rights movement or the advocacy that is put out there to try to help men, though, is the methodology for trying to change society instead of focusing on internal change, right? The methodology is the biggest issue where I have a difference of perspective from the MRAs, and why I would not really consider myself to be an MRA, even though I agree with 95+% of the stuff that they say and that they write about. I just don't think you're going to reform society. And I'm not going to get into this too much here because I've talked about it in the past and it would make this video way too long. But the biggest issue that I don't agree with MRAs is that they think that you can somehow convince women to change the system and give up their advantages, more or less. Because you can easily establish that women have control of the system now, but you have to convince women who are not going to be reasonable and are going to think that they deserve more rights no matter what, that they need to give up the idea of, for example, supporting abortion of convenience when men have no reproductive rights whatsoever, basically. Men's reproductive rights basically consist of don't stick your dick in crazy, but yet the entire rhetoric is that, oh, women's right to abortion of convenience has been compromised through the Dobbs case, for example, or in particular. So now we need to basically be all up in arms to protect women's reproductive rights. When you have a society like that, how are you really going to bring attention to men's problems for what they are and actually change things within that framework? In my opinion, it can't happen. But that being said, I still think that MRAs definitely have a positive place overall within the men's community because they are essentially talking about things for how they are. They're talking about what I just mentioned with men not having reproductive rights, or they're talking about how one-sided gender roles are, or they're talking about the family courts being as incredibly corrupt as they are and totally one-sided against men and fathers. They're at least bringing out the truth, and I think it has a positive effect because men can look at that and say, wait a second, maybe I shouldn't get married. Maybe I shouldn't have kids when my kids can be taken away from me because the woman just said that I was abusive. So I think that overall, the MRAs put the necessary information out there for men to make healthier decisions for themselves compared to if they listen to some of the other groups that I'm going to mention in this video. So again, I pretty much have more of a men going their own way philosophy, but I do agree with the vast majority of the points that MRAs make. It's just that I don't think that the methodology of trying to change the system or change the culture, none of that's going to happen because you can't reason with women, and women are already in control of the system, right? They would rather go out and put their hats that represent their genitalia on and go march on Washington because they don't like who got elected president than they would actually have a real conversation about what we can do to make things better for men and women. They're just not interested. Most women are just going to vote for the I'm oppressed, give me more free stuff, men are bad narrative. I'm not going to get into that too much. I feel like I've already been talking about it for too long. But I do feel like other than that difference of opinion in terms of methodology, that overall the MRAs put out a good message, MGTOW put out a good message. Those are the more positive influences within the men's community, in my opinion. On the other side of the coin, you have your pickup artists and your traditional conservatives, if you can even argue that the traditional conservatives are part of the men's community. But we definitely do, if we're being realistic, see a kind of seepage of the traditional conservative movement into the men's community. You could talk about why that is, but I think it's kind of just self-apparent up to this point. And so I want to talk about those groups, right? PUAs and tradcons generally have a negative message because their focus is still on getting men to participate in chasing women, particularly the PUAs, or in getting married on the traditional conservative side, trying to have a family unit despite how bad of an idea that often is in this environment, in this culture. It's not really your family, as Vincent used to say, it's her family, and you're just giving her children. So that's really a negative message because it puts men in a bad situation if they follow the advice that PUAs or traditional conservatives try to give them. Rarely do they give advice that could actually benefit individual men in terms of pursuing their own self-interest and well-being. Usually it's just about you need to chase women, you need to do what benefits society at your expense because you need to be an individual martyr for this system that doesn't respect you and couldn't care less about you anyway. That's a really negative message for men to hear, in my opinion. There are, of course, again, crossovers where you'll have someone that is kind of a traditional conservative, but they also get it and they also advise against marriage. They realize that that's a trap for men, even though they're traditional conservative when it comes to how they view what actually works, right? I myself am kind of a recovering traditional conservative. I don't really feel like there's any reason to conserve what's left about most of society today, but that's a different video and probably a video that I'll make soon. But in terms of other political views, you might be traditional leaning or conservative leaning, but you may still get that this isn't really a good way to go about trying to plan a life as an individual man today. But that's not where most of them are from what I see. And your PUAs definitely, they're all about essentially selling things. They're just marketing themselves in many cases to try to make money at men's expense within the men's community. And I think even though I don't have the approach of personally wanting to bring these people down, and sometimes they can give reasonable advice to men, but the overall intent, like I explained earlier, is bad. And so I tend to agree with Hammerhand and others that they have been really a poisonous and a toxic influence within this community since they became prominent. For the involuntarily or supposedly involuntarily celibate men, the incels, I think it can really go either way. But the overall sort of inherent outlook that they have is definitely negative. I think they have a potential for a positive message, but only if they focus on the alternatives to winning validation from women. And those alternatives, I think, in many cases would lead them to having a MGTOW type of perspective instead. But that's not where a lot of them are. Oftentimes, incels will get stuck in seeing themselves as unworthy because of their negative experiences with women, and this is not very healthy. And so I would say overall being an incel, or sort of wrapping yourself around the whole idea of my identity is as an incel, that's not really a healthy perspective, especially when the reality is that women can be bought. If you have $200, maybe now in this environment with all the inflation, maybe now it's $300. If you have that amount of money, you don't have to be an incel, right? That's the sad reality of that on the other side of the coin as well, is that you're not really involuntarily celibate if you're willing to do what it takes to try to get enough money to waste on something that you shouldn't waste it on anyway, trying to spend the night with a woman, right? It's really not worth it. I can see how they get caught up in that sort of negative mentality, but it's really not necessary, and it's kind of an unhealthy place to be. So I would say that overall, the incel perspective is kind of negative, with the potential for a positive outcome if they start to focus on other things instead of, well, I can't get a woman, I can't get a date, I can't get laid. Those kinds of things are potentially something that can set you down a better path if you give up on those things and focus on things that actually lead to your benefit. But being stuck in the mindset of, I just can't get a woman, that's my identity, that's definitely not healthy. So it depends on which way it goes for those individual men that consider themselves incels. But in a lot of cases, if you don't find something else to structure your life around that's positive, you're not going to have a good experience with that. So it's kind of a negative thing, in my opinion. I think a lot of these men would be better off going their own way in some form or fashion instead. So again, I think the overall value of the men's community as a whole, the positive aspects, is to provide information to help men better themselves, while the negative influences within the men's community come from those who want men to continue to focus on benefiting others instead. And so the overall point of part 1 of this video is to say that I think that's a good overall litmus test, so to speak, for determining whether something is a good or bad in a very general sense example of content in the manosphere. If it's at least a message that's trying to help men at the individual level, that's trying to give them information, awareness, a point of view that can help them make better decisions for themselves, that is a good thing. That is a positive, potentially positive effect and a valuable part of the men's community. But if you have something that just says you need to continue to try to find the good women, or you just need to use women for sex, or your focus needs to be on women, your focus needs to be on society, that kind of content, it's really not material that actually benefits the men's community in any way. It detracts from the men's community. And I do think you see more and more of this on purpose for a reason. And I'm going to get into that in the second part of this video, which is primarily going to be about how the red pill has been redefined, supposedly, what the red pill really actually is supposed to be, what it actually is, and why I think we see the sort of decline in the men's community along those lines, why it is that the red pill seems to be so much harder to define now than it was even just a few years ago, why it is that you have these negative influences in the manosphere that have become so prominent, like the PUAs and the tradcons, in my humble opinion. People can disagree and think that those particular groups have had a positive influence in some cases. I think for the most part that's not really the case. I think that it's true that the men's community has gone downhill, and it's gone downhill for a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons is that these other groups have become more prominent, that the actual healthy content about improving yourself as an individual has really taken a back seat to this other stuff, and I'm going to get into that in part 2. Thanks for watching this video. Feel free to voice your agreement or disagreement, but that's my take, right? I think that these different groups within the men's community can be sort of assessed, and the content, the message that's being put out by any particular channel or content creator can be assessed based on whether it's providing information that can conceivably help men make better decisions for themselves and move their lives in a better direction, whereas the negative shit, that's all about just telling men that they need to do things that benefit society, that involve chasing women, that involve not acknowledging where things really stand for men. Those kinds of things are negative and should be pretty much just not listened to as much as possible, right? Those messages should be ignored. So that's my take in this part of the video. Thanks for watching.